wonderful civic action that's going on by a number of groups that have won battles. They haven't won the war yet, but have won significant battles. Unfortunately, I think by time I can get into Harrisburg, the issue around ME2 may be over. I hope it's not. But we have ME2X and ME3 coming, so we have more pipelines coming. Short term, right now, the civic action that's going on is phenomenal. They're finally getting the attention it deserves. I think there's some issues around ultimately how much money has been sunk in capital cost on the pipeline, and the result that if it was to be stopped, the kind of lawsuits that would be coming to the state, which would probably prevent the legislature from ever stopping it. But it's bad, as you all know, for the environment. It's outrageously bad for the public safety. And it's really bad for personal property rights and home equity. They did not take home equity into account when they're looking at this wonderful supposed economic boon we're having. But if you're living along the pipeline, you can't sell your house, or your house values dropped 20%, you've lost real value to your own personal bank account. Ideally, right now, if the pipeline could be changed, at minimum, what they haven't built yet should be built with what I call secondary containment. So if you're in the chemical industry, whenever time you have a dangerous material, you provide secondary containment. So if you have a tank, it's a double wall tank, a tank and a tank. If you have a pipeline, it should be a pipe and a pipe. And what that does, it doesn't eliminate the risk, but it significantly reduces the risk. So that if the pipeline, the inner pipe that's carrying the material breaks, you have a second pipe that at least will give you warning and time to evacuate, or maybe contain it so that it doesn't actually get out to the environment.
That seems like a simple solution. Why isn't that being done now?
Well, it would probably cost $1 billion to Sunoco, so they would fight it, and I don't know why. In one of the products I make, which is actually environmentally sound, we actually just built a plant in Memphis, Tennessee. It's used to disinfect water with a product that breaks down to vinegar. And the city of Memphis, we actually have it on their site, and we're pumping this material half a mile from the front of their plant to the back of the plant, and we're required to have a secondary containment on something that breaks down to vinegar. Transport pipelines, typically they don't put them in because of the expense, but you look at all the oil spills we've had everywhere, and it would sure make a lot of sense to me. And on top of that, you could put sensors in between the interstitial space between the two pipes, so that if there was a leak, you have a chance of detecting it. Having a sensor sitting outside somewhere, you don't know if you'd ever detect it before you had a chance to stop it. I don't know why. Yeah.
I know why. You can't bend dual pipe to follow the contour of the lane.
But you can weld it.
You can engineer it.
How? I weld for a living. It's you take two pipes and you want to bend a 30-degree angle in them. How do you do that? You have to put a mandrel in the internal pipe, but what do you do with the outside shell? It will buckle. It'll fail. You're building in defects into it. It would never pass an inspection.
Well, we'll have to talk about that, because the pipes we're doing, which aren't as large, you put support structures in there, and
well, that
it's
would
expensive.
be not on 350 miles.
So,
But so that's the problem. So now we're looking at, there's a very large expense versus public safety. And this is a unique material. So the first thing I would have done is actually run that risk assessment everybody wants now. I would have run it 2 years ago and planned the route of the pipe with the least amount of public risk. Once it entered Delaware County, but even before that, and the population density increased, there should have been a requirement that that pipe was planned with the least amount of risk. And you don't even have to doubly contain all this pipe. You only need to do it around the high risk areas.
Well, I found at Pico Energy in Eddystone, we have wall thickness maybe 4 inches on the stainless steel high pressure line. So it's top grade, I think 316L stainless with a 4-inch wall just to protect the guys who walk the stairwells.
Right.
Where the high pressure line run. You know, so now, talk about 350 miles of that. You know, and I don't even think it can be manufactured in the States anymore, that type of pipe.
So good to chew on. I'm going to ask that we keep it to questions, and if you want to have an off the, a policy proposal discussion, that we do it in the chat session afterwards.
Well, let me address the long-term thing.
It is totally at your discretion.
Yeah, and let's talk about more of that afterwards, but let's talk about the long-term plan. So we have more of these pipelines coming, and what I would like to see legislatively change in Harrisburg is how the Public Utility Commission determines what is a public utility. So right now, Sunoco back-ended into this because they bought a 80-year-old company that actually used to supply fuel oil from Philly out to the suburbs. I think we should be looking at each project individually on whether it's a public utility or not. So instead of grandfathering in this pipeline should have been reviewed as a public utility, and it really should have been addressed, is there a public utility value to it? So I would like to see changes in the Public Utility Commission. I would like to see, I don't know if you're all aware, but part of the Public Utilities Commission's job is to promote actual pipelines, because in the old days they wanted, before the suburbs were built up, they wanted to bring fuel oil from Philadelphia out to the suburbs. So we actually have the Public Utility Commission, which is in charge of oversight and okaying these pipelines. Also, part of their job is to promote these pipelines, and I believe there's a bit of conflict of interest there. So we need to separate that. They need to become more of a regulatory agency. We also need to ensure that the Department of Environmental Protection is fully funded and also given the actual regulatory teeth to protect our water. And really, we should be taking the politics and the money out of decisions that the Department of Environmental Protection are taking. They should be looking at it purely from a regulatory and public safety and environmental issue. Actually, they're more environmental, not public safety, but they should be addressing these issues purely from an environmental point of view without a lot of political oversight. They should have very strict rules on how to approve or not approve or stop a project that is damaging our environment, because it is in our state constitution that our environment needs to be protected. And so I think the Department of Environmental Protection needs to be enhanced, have enough inspectors, and also have the regulatory teeth to buck the governor's office, buck the state legislators, say, no, this is a danger to our environment, and we're going to assess it on that. So those are two issues. Long term, I think we need to enhance how these pipelines are approved and regulated at the state level.
Follow-ups?
Well, I talked to Mr. Casey out in West Goshen, and he wants to welcome the status that ME2 has Public Utility Commission rights, because then there's a whole new toolbox of that safety regulations that they had to stand behind. And he's working on that with Senator Dinniman to try to get some kind of legislation where, okay, it's a public utility, let's make it work like a public utility. And he's, I don't know how far ahead he is. I talked to him maybe 2 weeks ago, and he's fired up. He's ready to go with it.
So a lot of that is actually stuck in committee, but yes, if they've been granted public utility status, then they should be held to a high standard of being a public utility. Absolutely. I'm not sure in the first place they ever should have been granted public utility status. And what that allowed them to do is have public utility eminent domain. And to me, that's an issue that's also not talked a lot about, but our personal property rights are impacted here. So right now, Sunoco actually claims the entire Delaware County as their public utility right-of-way. So they can put a pipeline in 5 years from now through your front yard, and you don't have a statement because they've been granted public utility status, and as a result, they have right-of-way anywhere. So that's the problem with granting public utility status. Once they have it, they should be held to very high standards, and I absolutely agree, and I will actively support on the House side the whole list of legislative positions that Senator Dinniman has suggested. There's a whole list of them. I would actively support that on the House side because they have been granted that. I'm just concerned that they were granted it in the first place. And I'd like to use this as an example. Could you imagine here in media if a nuclear hazardous waste dump was decided to be put right here in media because we need it as a public utility? Everybody in this region would be up in arms, regardless of the amount of jobs it might create or not create. People wouldn't want it here, or a hazardous waste incinerator, when you can actually see it and you can actually envision what the potential risk to the citizenry is. Once this pipe's in the ground, people are going to forget about it, but the hazard's still there. And so to me, there's a disconnect. We'll stand up and fight for not having an incinerator in our backyard, but we're putting a true incinerator in the ground, and we've lost our ability to fight against that. So yes, they've been granted. I would absolutely support the regulations to ensure that they're meeting the public utility status, but I have a problem with the fact that they were granted that in the first place, and now that any pipe they decide to put in, either as a citizen or as a municipal councilman, my municipality has zero impact right now to stop a pipeline from coming in. So my borough sovereignty is at risk as well, not only to mention your personal property rights, but your borough's sovereignty is at risk as well. So I really would love to see changes in how these kind of pipelines or other things are determined as public utilities and not.
But are there two different things, granted and grandfathered?
Right.
It's grandfathered in our case.
That's correct.
And so nobody granted anything, it was grandfathered when they purchased that 8-inch pipeline. And the right of way was bullied, and my biggest question of the year is, why was it cut through Middletown and not follow the original course to Marcus Hook?
Right.
Why was there 11.5 miles change? Is there some kind of fault we're not hearing about in the line that goes through Aston? Are they gonna abandon it like they did Mariner 1 in Middletown, right at the border with Chester Heights? I mean, what aren't they telling us? And I understand that the smart pig data that goes to the cloud has been hacked. They can make it look like anything they want.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to talk about that here. The only thing I will mention is that grandfathering is what I would like to see changed. We need to, again, look at every single new project as a new project and not just grandfathered in. And that's one of the legislative rules I'd like to see changed. Yes.
I have a question for Ellen. What's the next question?
Is that your question?
How do you get stuff done in a Republican legislature? That's the short version.
Okay.
Shall I?
Please.
Following the 2016 elections, the House consisted of 121 Republicans and 82 Democrats. That's the TA. If the Republicans retain the majority, and we are expecting that, and the Democrats hold the governor's slot, what strategies will you employ to pass progressive legislation?
Good question. I get this asked a lot, and I will give you a straight-up answer. A lot of politicians will be out there, and the first thing they'll say is, I'm good at working across the aisle, and I will do bipartisan work. The truth is, right now, there's about 2 Republicans to every Democrat in the state legislature. We will make gains in 2018. I believe we will take the House in 2020. There's a slight chance in 2018, I don't think so, but I think 2020 is a realistic goal for the Democrats to take the House. There are certain pieces of legislation that you can work bipartisan. As an example, the legislation that's moving on, not moving on anti-gerrymandering, which has actually wide bipartisan support, is stuck in committee because of the one committee chairperson refuses to let it go. But there are legislations you can actually work on a bipartisanship. But the real fact is that given the Republican to Democrat ratio, my job basically for the first year or two is really going to be more defensive and stopping bad legislation from going through. It doesn't sound sexy, but it's very, very important. There is a lot of value in stopping bad legislation. As an example, we almost had legislation go through that would have made Pennsylvania the most restrictive anti